This is how it happened. In front of a room full of fake smiles and pats on the back, I took the microphone, feeling the weight of the moment. The company party was a pompous celebration, planned to show off successes and achievements, but at that moment, all I saw were masks. Masks that hid secrets, lies and betrayals. I knew that once the words were out of my mouth, there would be no turning back. But that was exactly what I wanted. I'd like to take this opportunity to share some important news about the future. About my future, to be exact. The room fell silent. People who had previously been laughing and toasting began to look at me expectantly. There was something in my voice that hinted at the somber tone. I continued, ignoring the trembling hand holding the microphone. I'm announcing the end of my marriage. A gasp of shock ran through the room. She was standing there, a few meters away from me, in her impeccable dress and frozen smile, trying to process the impact of my words. But for me, everything had already been decided. I had spent months putting together the pieces of a betrayal that began as a suspicion and became a nightmare. It started small. A dinner that took longer than expected. Cell phone messages deleted without explanation. A perfume that wasn't hers lingering on his clothes. Things that, at first, I tried to ignore. It's all in my head, I thought, trying not to let paranoia consume me. But doubt is a dangerous seed. And when it finds fertile ground, it grows quickly, suffocating any hope of trust. I remember one night in particular. She was in the shower and her cell phone vibrated on the counter. Something pulled me like a magnet to that screen. I hesitated. Touching someone's cell phone is crossing a line, right? But my hand seemed to act on its own. And there it was. A message from a number I didn't know. Looking forward to tomorrow night. Can't wait to see you again. My heart raced. I swallowed and put the phone away exactly where it was. I didn't confront him immediately, because part of me still didn't want to believe it. Instead, I decided to observe. I waited for more clues, more signs. And it didn't take long for them to appear. That same number, now identified as a work colleague, appeared frequently in our mundane conversations. A friend she had never mentioned before. I began to notice how she laughed too much at his jokes, how her work meetings began to drag on inexplicably. That same week, I did what I thought was unthinkable. I hired a private detective. Not for lack of courage, but because I needed proof. Something more solid than a message or a hunch. He was efficient, quick. He didn't take long to bring me what I feared. Photos of the two of them together, intimate smiles, looks that only those who have loved deeply recognize. And there was more. Videos revealing discreet encounters in restaurants and hotels. But the final blow came unexpectedly. During a work meeting, I received an urgent call from the detective. He asked me to meet him in person. When I arrived at the agreed place, he handed me an envelope. I thought you might want to see this before you decide what to do. Inside were confidential documents. Contracts from my company, signed and leaked to competitors. Data that could only have come from someone on the inside. That's not possible, I muttered, as the words seemed to explode in my mind. He nodded with a serious look on his face. I'm sorry to say, but it seems that your wife and that man are involved in something beyond the personal. Perhaps it's worth investigating further. And that's exactly what I did. I spent sleepless nights going through emails, old contracts, forgotten conversations. Little by little, the puzzle began to come together. It wasn't just a love affair. She was sabotaging me. Betraying not just my heart, but everything I had worked for over the years. I remember the day I finally confronted her. I waited until she got home from a work meeting. I sat on the sofa with the envelope in hand, my heart beating so hard that it seemed to echo in the living room. When she came in, I could see the tension on her face. Perhaps she already knew that her game was up. We need to talk, I said, keeping my voice steady, even though inside I was shattered. She hesitated for a moment, but sat down opposite me. "What is it?" I put the envelope on the table between us. "I thought you might want to explain it to me." Her eyes went from the envelope to me and back to the envelope. She tried to deny it, to make excuses, but the evidence was undeniable. The silence that followed was worse than any scream or fight. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you do that? To me, to us?" She looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say something that would make it all make sense. Something that would justify the chaos she had caused. But there was no justification. Just an empty, cold stare that confirmed what I already knew. I was just a piece on her board. That's when I decided. If she wanted to play, I would play too. But with my own rules. And so, sitting there at that company party, microphone in hand, I made my final move. My heart was pounding as loudly as the whispers around me. I knew that the news would travel fast, that she would face not only my wrath, but also the critical eye of everyone she had deceived. What no one knew, however, was what I planned to do next. Because although her lies had already come to light, I still held on to the last letter. Something that would not only change our lives, but also the future of everyone in that room. And when I reached the end of my announcement, I saw the look of shock in her eyes. She knew the end was near, but she still had no idea what was to come. What exactly happened at that party and in the days that followed? And what was the secret I was still hiding? Well, that, of course, is another story. Welcome to our channel. Here, we in no way support any kind of betrayal. All the stories you'll hear are fictional and aim to show how betrayal can devastate lives, bonds and hearts. Get ready, because now you're going to dive into an intense and shocking story that will stir your emotions. Happy listening. The sound of the coffee machine filled the kitchen as Daniel watched the foam slowly form in his cup. He always started his mornings like this, with a strong dose of coffee to organize his thoughts before plunging into the chaos of the day. On the other side of the table, Carolina was concentrating on her cell phone, her fingers gliding quickly across the screen as she bit into a piece of toast almost by reflex. Their routine was a silent reflection of the relationship they had built over 10 years of marriage. Daniel, a 38-year-old man, was a partner in a medium-sized company that provided technological solutions for large corporations. A dedicated leader, he spent long hours in the office, always focused on ensuring the expansion of the business and, consequently, the financial stability they both valued so much. Despite his professional success, Daniel was not an arrogant man. On the contrary, he was known for his patience and the way he dealt with the pressures of work. However, behind his calm and controlled demeanor, there was a growing restlessness, a nagging feeling that something in his life was slipping through his fingers. Carolina, on the other hand, was a 35-year-old woman with a sharp eye and a magnetic presence. With a degree in communications, she worked in the marketing department of a large company. Her career, marked by achievements, was not only a reflection of her intelligence, but also of her ability to build meaningful connections. Carolina had a charisma that lit up any room, but recently it seemed that this energy had been drained. Her smile, once constant, now appeared only on sporadic occasions, and the moments of silence between her and Daniel became more frequent. The house they lived in was large and spacious, with a modern decor that reflected their practical style. Abstract paintings adorned the walls, recalling the travels and achievements the couple had shared over the years. It was a house that was supposed to represent a home, but lately it felt more like a functional space, without the warmth that had once been present. The living room, with its impeccable leather sofa, still held remnants of quiet evenings when the two of them watched movies together and shared popcorn. Now, however, it just seemed like any other room. That morning, Daniel noticed that Carolina seemed more distant than usual. Her gaze was fixed on her cell phone screen, her lips pursed in an expression of concentration. "Is everything all right?" he asked casually, but there was a genuine tone of concern in his voice. Carolina looked up, hesitated for a moment, and then smiled a quick, rehearsed smile. "Yes, of course. Just going over some work stuff." Daniel didn't insist. He had learned over the years that Carolina had her moments of introspection, and trying to pull something out of her in those moments was usually in vain. He sipped his coffee, looking out the kitchen window. The sunlight streamed in lazily, bathing the floor in golden hues. For a moment, he wondered if he was being paranoid, but pushed the thought away. Work had always been a priority for both of them, and he knew how exhausting the demands of marketing were. Carolina, however, felt the weight of his question. It wasn't that she wanted to hide something, but there was a whirlwind of emotions inside her that she herself couldn't understand. In recent months, Carolina had begun to question her choices, her priorities. Marriage, which used to be her safe haven, now seemed like an anchor, holding her to something she didn't know if she wanted anymore. She loved Daniel, there was no doubt about that, but love seemed to have changed shape, transformed into something calmer, more predictable. The watch on Daniel's wrist beeped, reminding him that it was time to leave for work. He put his cup in the sink and, before picking up his briefcase, leaned over to kiss Carolina on the forehead. "I'll see you tonight," he said with a kindness that seemed genuine, but which didn't disguise the distance they both felt. Carolina just nodded, her smile again forced, and turned her attention back to her cell phone. On the way to work, Daniel tried to concentrate on the challenges of the day, but the silence of the kitchen kept echoing in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place, but he didn't know exactly what. It was as if an invisible piece of the puzzle of his life had been displaced, and he couldn't identify which one. Meanwhile, Carolina sat at the kitchen table, her coffee untouched, while she stared at her cell phone screen without really seeing anything. She felt a tightness in her chest, a restlessness that manifested itself in every decision she had to make. The routine, once comfortable, now seemed suffocating. The evenings of relaxed conversation with Daniel had been replaced by uncomfortable silences, and she no longer knew how to break them. In the evenings, the scene wasn't much different. Daniel came home exhausted, but carrying a bottle of wine in an attempt to lighten the heavy mood that hung over them. Carolina was sitting on the sofa, distracted by a TV program she clearly wasn't following. He sat down next to her, opened the wine and poured 2 glasses. "We need to go out more," he said, trying to sound casual. "Remember how much fun it was when we had those last-minute getaways to the coast?" Carolina shrugged. "It's been a long time since we've had time for that, hasn't it?" "Maybe it's time we changed that," he insisted, trying to search her eyes for any trace of the vibrant woman he had known. But all he found was tiredness. Carolina turned her face away, avoiding his gaze, and took a sip of her wine. Silence filled the room again. Daniel knew he was trying to save something that he still didn't understand how it had been lost. Carolina, on the other hand, felt a growing guilt, a weight she didn't know how to share. They were both trapped in a silent game of conflicting emotions, trying to understand how 2 strangers had appeared in the place where a couple once existed. The house once again sank into stillness. The wine ran out and they each went to their rooms at different times, an almost physical distance between them. But when the lights went out, neither of them could sleep. While Carolina stared at the ceiling, fighting her own thoughts, Daniel looked out of the window, trying to find an answer in the starry sky to questions he didn't even know how to ask. The cold morning wind seemed to cut into Daniel's skin as he hurried across the company parking lot. The strong coffee hadn't been enough to dispel the fog of restlessness that seemed to follow his every move over the last few days. As he entered the office, he was greeted with the usual greetings from his colleagues, but something in the atmosphere seemed different. A silent unease hung in the air, as if something was being said on the sly, just out of reach. Sitting at his desk, Daniel tried to concentrate on the contracts in front of him, but his mind insisted on wandering. The silent nights next to Carolina were becoming unbearable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something crucial was slipping through his fingers. He mentally reviewed every recent moment between them, looking for clues, explanations. But everything seemed hazy, as if the answer was right there, but he just couldn't see it. Meanwhile, Carolina was finishing getting ready for a meeting outside the office. She was wearing a new dress, discreet but with a cut that subtly highlighted her curves. In the mirror, she touched up her lipstick and took a deep breath, as if trying to convince herself that everything was under control. She picked up her bag and walked out the door without saying a word to Daniel. He had already left for work, but even if he had been at home, she knew he wouldn't have offered any explanations. During the day, Carolina found herself in a secluded cafe, far from any familiar eyes. She sat in a discreet corner, her eyes focused on the entrance. A few minutes later, a tall, confident-looking man entered and walked up to her. He smiled, and Carolina smiled back, but it was a smile she hadn't shown at home for a long time. The two of them talked quietly, gestures almost imperceptible, as if they were choreographing a secret. Daniel, however, remained immersed in his work, trying to ignore the weight that seemed to grow on his chest. He barely noticed when his assistant left an envelope on his desk, with a note attached to the front. "For your urgent analysis." Curious, he opened the envelope and found documents that clearly weren't just part of his job. The contents detailed suspicious financial transactions linked to his company, but what caught his eye was the signature at the bottom of one of the contracts, Carolina. For a moment, he thought it might be a mistake, a coincidence. But the date and the details made him freeze. It was impossible to ignore the connection. His head spinning, he decided to leave the office early. His mind was in a whirl and he needed answers. At home, Daniel found the living room empty, but Carolina's cell phone lying forgotten on the sofa. He hesitated, but something inside him pushed him to pick it up. The messages were password protected, but the notifications on the screen already told part of the story. A name he didn't recognize appeared repeatedly, messages sent and received frequently over the last few days. "It was amazing today," said one of the text previews. The sound of the front door interrupted his thoughts. Carolina walked in, carrying shopping bags, her face lit by a smile that quickly disappeared when she saw him with his cell phone in hand. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice firm but with a slight tremor that didn't go unnoticed. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding up the device. The silence that followed was devastating. Carolina hesitated for a moment before stepping forward to take the phone, but Daniel stepped back, keeping it out of reach. "Who's that?" he continued, his voice now full of tension. "It's just a colleague from work," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. But Daniel was no fool. He felt the weight of every word, the subtext she was trying to hide. "So why are you exchanging messages like that?" he asked, throwing the words in her face like an accusation. Carolina crossed her arms, looking away. "You're exaggerating." "It's nothing, Daniel." But for him, it was everything. Without saying another word, he put down his cell phone and left the house. The night was cold, and the fresh air helped to clear his thoughts. He walked for hours, aimlessly, trying to understand how they had gotten to this point. He remembered every moment when he had tried to strengthen the relationship, every attempt to reconnect the bond that seemed to be weakening. And now this. The betrayal was there, plain as day, but he couldn't accept it. Not yet. While Daniel wandered the streets, Carolina was at home, sitting on the sofa, staring at her cell phone. She knew that the truth was about to be exposed, but she didn't know how to deal with it. Her mind was torn between guilt and justification, trying to find a way to protect what was left of her life with Daniel. The next day, Daniel made a decision. He hired a detective to find out the whole truth. He needed to know, in detail, what was going on, who the man involved was and what else Carolina was hiding. For days, he waited for the detective's reports, each hour more painful than the last. When he finally received the envelope, he felt a crushing weight in his chest. Inside were photos, decoded messages and information that confirmed his worst suspicions. Carolina was having an affair with a man who, ironically, had professional connections with him. Someone who was not only involved in his personal life, but was also sabotaging the company he had fought so hard to build. That night, Daniel sat alone in his living room, looking at the evidence. He felt anger, sadness, but above all, an overwhelming sense of betrayal. It wasn't just about the case. It was about the breach of trust on every possible level. He knew he had to confront her, but he also knew that this was only the beginning. Something about the situation didn't make sense. The pieces were still falling into place, but there was something bigger behind it. When Carolina returned home, she found Daniel sitting at the table, the evidence spread out before him. She stopped at the door, her eyes wide. Before she could say anything, he spoke, his voice low but full of weight. "How long has this been going on?" She tried to answer, but words failed her. The expression on his face was one of pure disgust. He stood up, picked up the envelope containing the evidence and handed it to her. "I know everything. Now I just want to know why." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Carolina knew that there weren't enough excuses in the world to justify what she had done. But at that moment, she also knew that there was more at stake than just her marriage. Something that Daniel didn't know yet, but would soon find out. And when he did, nothing would ever be the same. The room was filled with a heavy, almost tangible silence. Daniel stood with his eyes fixed on Carolina. She held the envelope with trembling hands, unable to look directly at him. The minutes seemed to drag by as the tension increased, and each breath echoed like a roar in that suffocating space. "Aren't you going to say anything?" Daniel's voice finally broke the silence, laden with a frustration he no longer bothered to hide. "I've spent days trying to understand, Carolina. Days reliving every moment, every gesture, trying to find where we lost each other. And now, I see that you knew all along." Carolina raised her eyes, but couldn't find the courage to look at him for more than a second. She seemed to want to say something, but her throat seemed stuck. After a few seconds, she muttered, "I never meant to hurt you." Daniel laughed bitterly, running his hands through his hair. "Never wanted to hurt me?" He pointed to the envelope on the table. "That sounds a lot like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. You lied, you betrayed, and not just me. You messed with my life, my company. Why, Carolina? I want to understand." She finally found her voice, but not enough to hide her trembling. "It's not that simple, Daniel. Things got out of hand." "Then explain it to me." He slammed the table, the intensity of his words echoing in the room. "Because so far, all I see is betrayal. Not just as a wife, but as a partner. You've put everything I've built at risk." "Why?" Carolina hesitated, the words caught between her guilt and fear. Finally, she sighed deeply and began. "I was feeling lost, Daniel. For months, no, years, I felt suffocated, living a life that didn't seem to be mine. I loved you, but," her voice faltered, and she had to take a deep breath before continuing. "But love seemed different. Less intense. And I met someone who seemed to see me in a way that I no longer saw in you." He interrupted with an abrupt gesture. "I'm not talking about feelings. I'm talking about the contracts, Carolina. About the leaked information. About how you are apparently linked to the man who is sabotaging my company." Carolina froze. This was what she had feared. There was no more room for excuses or half-truths. She knew that if she didn't speak up now, she would never have the chance to explain herself. "What do you mean, Daniel?" His voice was low, almost inaudible. Daniel laughed, but his laugh was empty. "You know exactly what I mean. Your lover, or whatever he is part of a competing company. And you, it seems, helped him. I want the truth, Carolina. Now." The next few seconds seemed eternal. Carolina looked at him, tears starting to fill her eyes, but not because she was sorry, but because she knew there was no going back. She took a deep breath and finally began to speak. Yes, I helped him. At first, it was unconscious. He asked simple questions about his work, nothing that seemed harmful. I thought it was just curiosity. But then he started asking more, and more. And before I knew it, I was in too deep. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but he threatened me, Daniel. He said that if I didn't cooperate, he would destroy not only his company, but our reputation. Daniel remained motionless, his anger giving way to an expression of pure shock. He threatened you. And instead of telling me, you chose to betray me and everything we've built. Carolina tried to hold back her tears, but her voice failed her. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I thought that if I collaborated, I could control the situation. That I could protect you. Protect? Daniel stepped forward, his eyes burning with a mixture of pain and disbelief. You didn't protect me. You destroyed me. The confession had been made, but the tension in the room only increased. Carolina sobbed, while Daniel seemed to struggle to keep control of himself. He started pacing back and forth, trying to process what he had just heard. What now? He asked, finally stopping. What do you think is going to happen now, Carolina? Because, right now, I don't see a way to save any of this. Carolina wiped her eyes, but found no words. She knew there was no justification for what she had done. She knew that, no matter how hard she tried, the betrayal she had committed would not be forgiven. Daniel picked up the envelope from the table again and held it up. This evidence is all I need to finish you off. With him. But I still want to understand something. He moved closer to her, his voice now low, but charged with an almost suffocating intensity. Did you do it because you wanted to? Or because you had no choice? Carolina hesitated for a moment, but then raised her eyes to him, with an expression that mixed guilt and despair. At first, I thought I had a choice. But over time, I realized that I was trapped. The answer didn't seem to satisfy Daniel. He shook his head, as if trying to dispel the emotions that were consuming him. I don't know if I believe you, Carolina. But that doesn't matter now. He picked up his things and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned to face her one last time. Get ready. Because, from now on, there's no more room for lies. I'm going to find out every detail of this story. And when I do, you'll understand what it means to deal with the consequences. The door closed with a bang, leaving Carolina alone in the room. She fell to her knees, unable to hold back the tears. She knew that what would come next would be even more devastating. Daniel was determined, and nothing seemed to be able to stop him. The secret, although now partially exposed, still held layers that could change everything, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he found out. The door slammed hard, echoing in the house now plunged into silence. Carolina sat on the floor, her trembling hands resting on her knees. She didn't know how long it had been since Daniel had left, but the emptiness he had left seemed greater than anything she could have imagined. It was as if all the walls around her had collapsed, revealing a devastated landscape where there had once been a home. Daniel, meanwhile, was driving aimlessly, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness of the road. He had the feeling that he was trapped in a loop of incessant thoughts, each one more painful than the last. Carolina's betrayal was an open wound, but what hurt more was the weight of the dilemma he now carried, what to do with the information he had. He could simply hand over the evidence and let justice take its course, but something inside him still hesitated. It wasn't just the desire for revenge that drove him, but also a confusing sense of loss, of broken love and the complexity of what they had built together. The next day, Daniel met with his lawyer to discuss the legal implications of the evidence he had gathered. Sitting in a cold, impersonal conference room, he listened intently as the lawyer explained the consequences. Based on the evidence you have, we can not only sue your wife for breach of confidentiality, but also seek action against the competing company. This could lead to an extensive investigation, possibly even a criminal case. Daniel remained silent for a few moments before replying. What about her? What about Carolina? The lawyer hesitated, assessing Daniel's expression before answering. If you go through with it, she'll probably face legal consequences. Fines, possibly even imprisonment. Depending on how much involvement we can prove, things could get very serious. He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Despite everything, the thought of seeing Carolina destroyed filled him with a discomfort he couldn't ignore. There was still a part of him that loved her, a part that wanted to believe that she could redeem herself. But trusting her again seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Carolina was at home, trying to put the pieces of what was left together. Every corner of the house seemed loaded with memories, memories that now hurt more than they brought comfort. She sat in front of her computer, typing and deleting various messages to Daniel. She didn't know what to say that could change how he felt, but she knew she had to try. Daniel, she finally wrote, I know I've made mistakes that you'll never forget, but I still want you to know that it was never my intention to hurt you. I know there aren't enough apologies, but if there's anything I can do to make amends, please let me know. She clicked send and stared at the screen, waiting for a reply that didn't come. On the other side of town, Daniel stopped the car in a park. The place was secluded, and the tranquility seemed a cruel irony in contrast to the chaos in his mind. He sat on a bench, looking up at the sky as the first rays of sunlight appeared. It was a new day, but he felt trapped in the same endless night. The following days were marked by growing tension. Daniel began to realize that, while he was struggling to decide what to do, rumors of Carolina's betrayal were already starting to circulate. He bumped into a colleague in the company corridor, who made an apparently casual comment, I hear you're dealing with some delicate problems at home. If you need anything, you know where to find me. The insinuation behind the words was clear, and the humiliation only fueled her anger. Carolina also began to feel the weight of the consequences. During a meeting at work, she noticed furtive glances from her colleagues and whispers that stopped as soon as she entered the room. She knew that her professional life, as well as her personal life, was falling apart, and the guilt only added to the feeling that she had lost everything. But then an even more complex dilemma arose. Daniel received an anonymous phone call that completely changed the course of his thoughts. You need to know that Carolina wasn't just protecting herself, said the voice on the other end of the line. She may have done wrong, but there are much bigger people involved. If you reveal everything, they will fall. But that also means putting Carolina in an even worse position. He hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. If he continued with the investigations and revealed what he knew, he would not only destroy the competing company, but also possibly put Carolina in even greater danger. On the other hand, if he decided to protect Carolina, it would mean giving up any chance of revenge or justice. That evening, Daniel returned home to find Carolina sitting in the living room, her eyes swollen from crying. He sat in the opposite armchair, the silence between them so heavy that it seemed to suffocate them. I got a phone call today, he began, breaking the silence. Someone told me that there's more to this than just you. That there are bigger people involved. Carolina looked at him, surprised. Who told you that? I don't know, he replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. But what matters is that now I know you're not the only one responsible. And that complicates everything. She bowed her head, silent tears streaming down her face. I never wanted you to find out like this, Daniel. I thought I could control everything, that I could keep it away from you. But I failed. He watched her for a long time, trying to find some sign of the woman he knew, the woman he loved. But all he saw was a shadow, someone broken by the choices they had made. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice finally giving in to the weight of what he felt. I want to hate you, Carolina. I want to break up with you for everything you've done. But there's a part of me that still wants to protect you. And I don't know what that says about me. Carolina looked up, and for a moment, something changed in her expression. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just acceptance. "I don't deserve your protection, Daniel. But if you give me a chance to make it right, I'll do everything in my power to prove that there's still something in me that's worth it." Silence fell again, but this time it didn't seem so oppressive. It was as if, for the first time in weeks, there was a spark of something, perhaps redemption, perhaps complete destruction. But either way, they both knew they were approaching the end of a road that would change everything forever. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions that would mark Daniel and Carolina's lives forever. The silence between them was no longer one of repressed pain, but of acceptance that there was no going back to what existed before. They both knew they were in uncharted territory, where every choice carried irreversible consequences. Daniel finally decided to go ahead with the investigations against the competing company, but made it clear that Carolina would not be spared. He handed the lawyer all the evidence he had, including the documents linking his wife to the scam. The case quickly gained attention, and the man Carolina was involved with was the first to be investigated. He denied the accusations at first, but the pressure of the evidence led him to confess, revealing even darker details about how the scheme had been articulated. Carolina was called to testify. Sitting in front of lawyers and investigators, her figure seemed smaller, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the circumstances. She didn't try to justify her actions. On the contrary, she admitted her faults and explained her motivations, even if it meant facing public humiliation. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice shaking. "And I'm going to pay for it." Meanwhile, Daniel watched from a distance, torn between the relief of seeing justice done and the emptiness of realizing that, even with all the truth exposed, he felt no victory. His company survived the scandal, but the damage was evident. Many contracts were cancelled, and Daniel had to make severe cutbacks to maintain operations. But what troubled him most was the sense of personal loss. The person he trusted most had destroyed not only his work, but also the foundation of his life. After weeks of investigations and trials, Carolina received a reduced sentence due to her cooperation with the authorities. She didn't go to prison, but was ordered to do community service and pay a hefty fine that consumed almost all of her personal assets. Unemployed and socially isolated, she began to live simply, rebuilding her life in silence. The last meeting between Daniel and Carolina was brief and painful. He found her in the old cafe where they used to meet in the early years of their marriage. She was sitting at a table in the corner, wearing discreet clothes that reflected her new reality. Daniel hesitated before sitting down opposite her. "Why did you ask to meet me here?" he asked, his voice neutral, with no trace of the anger of before. Carolina looked up, visibly moved. "I needed to thank you, for not destroying me completely. You could have done that, but you chose something different." Daniel sighed, crossing his hands on the table. "I did what was right for the company, not for you. What you did is inexcusable, Carolina. But I'm not someone who destroys for the sake of destroying." She nodded, accepting the words with dignity. "I know there's nothing more between us, and I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I still care, even if it doesn't seem like enough." He looked at her for a long moment, trying to find the woman he once loved. But she was no longer there. There was only the shadow of someone he no longer recognized. Daniel stood up, throwing some notes on the table. "Take care, Carolina." And so he left for the last time. Months passed, and Daniel began to rebuild his life. He sold his share in the company, leaving it in the hands of new partners, and decided to move to another city. He bought a small house in a quiet place, far from the memories that haunted him. He began to devote his time to activities he had always wanted to try, but had never had the chance. Little by little, he found a new purpose, not based on work or the past, but on rediscovering himself. Carolina, on the other hand, followed a path of introspection. Between community service and moments of solitude, she began to reflect deeply on her choices. Little by little, she regained her passion for writing, something that had always been a refuge for her. In time, she published a fiction book based on her own experience, an honest account of how the wrong choices can destroy everything. The book wasn't a bestseller, but it brought her a little recognition that helped her move on. Carolina's lover, after the scandal, was fired and sued by the competing company, which sought to distance itself from his actions. His career was ruined and he disappeared from the public scene. Daniel and Carolina never met again. Their paths went in opposite directions, but they both learned profound lessons. He learned that blind trust can be dangerous, but that there is no greater strength than resilience. She, in turn, understood that the consequences of our actions are inevitable, but that there is always a chance to start again, even if the price is high. And so ends this story. A tale of betrayal, difficult choices and redemption, which reminds us how our decisions can shape lives in unexpected ways. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments, we want to know how you felt following every detail of this journey. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, here, we never support any form of betrayal. Our aim is to show how these acts can destroy lives and teach valuable lessons.